with you. Yeah, I'm just going to give a bit of a overview of the inquiry, what we're focusing on, and a bit around process today. So go to the first slide, if you could, please, Ian. So I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting. I'd also like to pay respects to elders past and present. I'm coming to you in from Canberra today, which is, I believe, Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. Next slide. Thanks, Ian. So just a bit about the Commission before we get started, and it's important to think about the context in which this inquiry is being undertaken. So we are the Australian government's primary economic research and advisory body. We look at economic, social and environmental issues and provide advice to government from that independent standpoint. Our hallmarks are evidence-based analysis, coming up with policy ideas that are actionable and implementable. And part of our role also is to inform and educate around the community around better policies in the long-term interests of the Australian community. Next slide. In terms of how we operate and how we're engaging in this inquiry, so we are an independent body. We are transparent in what we do. And so I'll mention that later in terms of the submissions to the inquiry. We operate importantly from an economy-wide and community-wide perspective. So that's important too when we're thinking about the stakeholders in the philanthropy sector in terms of donors, charities and recipients. We are an evidence-based organisation, as I said before, and so part of our role in this stage of the inquiry is to call for submissions and get the views of people who may be affected by policy changes in this area. And so those submissions are a key part of the evidence base that we're looking at in this inquiry and other areas. And finally, we have a proud tradition of testing policy issues. So if there's things that regulatory arrangements or tax changes or things that stakeholders think need to be changed, we're keen to hear about those, analyse them carefully, think about the costs and benefits, and then recommend them to government if we think that those benefits outweigh the costs. But again, I'll emphasise the economy and community-wide perspective that we bring to everything that we do. Next slide. Thanks, Ian. So I'll talk about a brief overview of the scope of the inquiry today, a bit around the process, explain ways in which people on this call can contribute to the inquiry as it rolls out, and then at the end we'll take some questions. Next slide, Ian. So our terms of reference, if you've read them, are pretty broad, but it falls into three main areas. The first is looking at trends in giving in Australia and motivations for giving. The second is that we've been asked to identify opportunities for and obstacles or barriers to increasing philanthropic giving in Australia. And the third is finally to recommend ways in which to respond to these opportunities and obstacles. So we are guided primarily by the terms of reference which come from the government for this inquiry, but we'll also refer to past reviews, and there's a number of those that we've done that are relevant to this space, and importantly, participant input and feedback via submissions and other vehicles, which I'll talk about a bit later on. So that's the terms of reference. So we received those back in February. And we've been, the team's been working hard and thinking about all of these issues. Next slide. Thanks, Ian. In terms of trends and motivations, it's important to understand the context of this part and the remainder of the inquiry, importantly from a policy point of view, and the overarching policy background here is that the government has adopted a target of trying to double giving by 2030. So, with that in mind, we take that as a that's the government's objective. We're keen to understand, whether that's actually achievable given past trends and understanding those trends, and then getting down into, well, why is it that some people do give, and importantly, why some people don't give, which is an important question given this policy goal of doubling giving. We're interested in who gives, both from an age perspective, gender, income, all of those different characteristics, the advantages and disadvantages of philanthropy as a source of revenue versus, say, government grants. Does it come with benefits and costs, and understanding why certain models of operating in philanthropy might be better than others. We're particularly interested as an evidence-based organisation in data, not only numerical data, but qualitative data, case studies, anything that can be brought to bear that will inform our policy recommendations going forward. It's really important that when the Commission makes a policy recommendation, that we can back it up either with examples, case studies, hard statistical analysis or other insights. And often the best source of those kinds of things are from people in the sector itself. And in particular, any data or case studies that aren't publicly available. Those are these really, these nuggets of gold that illustrate a point, a particular problem that might be addressed by changing government policy. And then we're keen also in this section of what we've been asked to do to look at alternative giving vehicles that might be currently unavailable in Australia. So different arrangements that might be able to facilitate more giving going forward. Next slide. Thanks, Ian. Second big topic area that we're looking at in the inquiry is opportunities and obstacles. So this includes broadly regulatory arrangements and tax arrangements. So it includes everything from the regulatory burden for donors or charities and the ways in which they're operating, any gaps in regulation, either at the federal or state level, any overlapping regulation, any inconsistencies in regulation. We've already had feedback from another number of participants on those sorts of topics, but we're keen to hear more on those things, and including, importantly, the roles and responsibilities of different regulators in this space. So the role of say, for example, the Australian Tax Office or the ACNC, or the state regulators around fair trading or fundraising. Those are all things that we're interested in hearing about. A key part of what we've been asked to look at is the deductible gift recipient framework, how that's working or not working, as the case may be, whether it can be reformed, simplified, changed in a way that enables better decisions to be made and allocate resources allocated better in terms of philanthropy. Tax concessions is a huge topic for us. So not only the tax concession for charitable donations, but also it's in our terms of reference where we're asked to look at the tax concessions more broadly for non-profits, so fringe benefits, tax arrangements and other concessions or exemptions. So those are very important. And I think we've also been asked to look at those in the context of the current fiscal environment and what it's likely to look like over the next decade or so. So that's an important consideration in some of our thinking, is that the costs in terms of revenue of these tax concessions, but also on the other side, the benefits that they may provide. A big topic finally is effectiveness of charities and their impact. So we've been thinking about donations from a consumer point of view, and whether if a person is handing their money over, whether they can judge where it's going, what it's actually achieving, and anything that can be done in that space in terms of measuring effectiveness or impact, and the extent to which that might facilitate more giving or a different mix of giving potentially. And then any other issues that we hear from that are identified by people making submissions, we're keen to hear about opportunities and obstacles of outside of those broad areas that I just talked about. Next slide, thanks Ian. And the final big area is putting all of those things together. What are the reform opportunities in Australia? This could range from anything from data and information gaps about philanthropy. And I should mention that we're not only talking about financial contributions here, we're talking about volunteering, donations in kind, thinking about all of those kinds of ways in which people give. We're primarily, I think it's fair to say, focused on financial contributions, but those other ways of giving we're also interested in, and particularly from a data point of view, financial giving, corporate giving, we have a reasonable handle on, but in terms of data, less information seems to be available in terms of volunteering and other forms of giving. So we're keen to hear about those sorts of things, and whether a policy reform might be for the government to collect more information and provide more information about those forms of giving. Another possible reform area that we've had feedback on is public strategies to increase the status of giving. So whether that's around public information campaigns or any ways in which, and whether there's a role for government or other organisations in facilitating a culture of giving in Australia relative to other countries. And in particular, with all of these things around reform, we're interested in the impacts and costs and benefits of reform opportunities. So that goes back to our, our mandate as an organisation is to provide, strong and rigorous economic advice to government. And the way we do that primarily is by assessing possible impacts and thinking about costs and benefits in a transparent and clear way. And also often that involves thinking about unintended consequences of either the status quo or business as usual relative to any reform that might be recommended. So that's it in terms of those three big areas of the scope of the inquiry. If I could just have the next slide. Thanks, Ian. Our inquiry process and milestones. So we issued a call for submissions paper in March. Submissions are due by the 5th of May. We're going to be holding roundtable discussions in June and July. We'll publish a draft report in November. Public hearings in February, early next year, and then 11th of May in 2024, our final report is due to government. So those are the major milestones. If I can just have the next slide. Thanks, Ian. So how you can contribute to this inquiry. The most direct way is to make a submission. That can be individual or through an organisation. It can be any length. It can be provided in written form or by video. It can cover as few of the issues that are covered in the terms of reference as you want, or as many as you want. And submissions, importantly, are made public. So that's part of our transparency mandate. In certain circumstances, we do allow for confidential submissions, but that's the exception rather than the norm. If you don't want to make a submission, you can just leave a comment on the inquiry's website. And that's, if it's just a brief comment, we do read them and take them into account when we're thinking about the draft report and final report. You can register to receive updates if you just want to keep in contact with where we're up to in terms of the process. When we do have the roundtables or public hearings, there's an opportunity for people who are interested in the issues to come and speak to us directly, or you can call us or meet with us. So there's many different ways that you can contribute. And as I said at the outset, we're keen to get as many submissions or comments any sort of feedback as we can, because that's a key part of forming the evidence base as we go forward and framing the rest of the report. Next slide. Thanks, Ian. So that's it from me. I should just add, that we are keen to hear from, all groups and individuals in the philanthropic space, whether it's recipients, donors, charitable organisations, people with a legal background and a legal interest, as we have on this call, and from all walks of life. So whether it's younger individuals who are volunteering or donating, older individuals who thinking about bequests and that sort of thing, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives we're particularly interested in. So we're keen to hear from as broad a set of Australians as we can for this inquiry. But I might hand it over to you, Ian, and we'll get to some questions and discussion. You're on mute.
And Julie's hand's up as well.
There we are. Thank you so much for that, Alex. Yes, I've seen. So Julie has her hand up. So we might go to Julie in a moment. And if people are just thinking of their questions in the meantime, because we will go to Q&A in a moment, if you have a question, please just raise your hand or post it in the chat. But Julie, you have your hand up.
Oh, thanks very much, Ian. It's just that where you identify problems, given the technical expertise of your members, it's super helpful for us if you've got an idea how something could be resolved. So that would be a really important contribution you could make for us. Thank you.
Yeah, so don't just complain. Please try and have a solution to the issue that you're raising.
And I should just also add, Ian, that we have not yet formed views on any of those topics. So if the question to us is going to be, oh, what's your view on this? We'll probably most likely just turn it straight back and ask the question of, well, what do you think? So that's where we are in terms of the process.
Fantastic. And Krystian, did you want to add anything either?
No, great summary by Alex, and really take Julie's point around the sort of providing sort of options for consideration in terms of solutions. And one thing I'd also add is that in our terms of reference, there is a little line saying sort of we have to have regard to the integrity of the taxation system and the current fiscal environment as well. So thinking about sort of obviously a matter for government as to what they do with our recommendations and their costs, etc., like in terms of they have a tax expenditure associated with them, etc. But being aware of sort of the that context is helpful in terms of framing submissions, because it is mentioned in our terms of reference. And I did see a comment from Stacey Turner about just for context, what's the overall reason that the government's interested in doubling or generally increasing the philanthropic revenue raised in Australia? I suppose we're sort of taking that as a given that the government's got that objective, and we wouldn't be able to comment on why they do or don't want to do that. It was an election commitment, but we're sort of taking it as a given in terms of that's the government objective and their sort of stated target, and we're sort of looking at the framework and the environment for giving and all those things that Alex talked about, and then making recommendations to government, and then government will take them and use them hopefully to inform their thinking around how they can achieve that objective itself.
Fantastic. Thank you, Krystian. So Stacey had posted a question, but I might just check. I've got a few questions here that I'll happily start asking if others don't have questions, but I'll just pause and just check. Did anyone want to raise their hand or post a question in chat?
Ian, it's Darren Fittler speaking. I have a question, if that's all right.
Go ahead, Darren.
I'm interested on the views on whether you'll be thinking about the definition of philanthropy. And as an example, obviously, we could probably double philanthropy by expanding the definition of philanthropy and what we count as philanthropy. And it's been suggested that, the hours that people volunteer their time is actually a philanthropic gift of time, and a philanthropic gift of corporate law firms doing work for pro bono is also a philanthropic act that does not involve handing over money. And not to confuse these things as being tax deductible, because I know that's a very big can of worms, but more, is the Commission thinking about what philanthropy itself actually means and how we define it?
Could I just respond to the second point, and then I'm sure Alex will respond to the first. We are after data, if you're able to help us, about things like the hours that firms give in Philanthropy to do pro bono work. So any data you can give us, we'd be interested in, because it's very hard for us to get that. But Alex, over to you for the main question that Darren asked.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. Thanks, Darren. Look, it is something that we're thinking about, but it's one of those ones, like I said before, we would probably turn it back on you, Darren, and you know, if we get submissions to say that, well, philanthropy includes those things that you were talking about and other things, and you really can't ignore them for a reason A, B, and C, and or whatever it is, or other people might say, no, you need to constrain it to be this definition. I mean, we do have a working definition, that's from, I think it's from Philanthropy Australia, that we've looked at, but we're interested in people's views on, whether the things that you mentioned and other aspects should be included in the definition of giving. Absolutely. So we're keen to hear from people about that.
Great, thanks.
And I'm just noting in the chat, I can see that Luke Hall has posted up a link to the Australian Pro Bono Centre, which does collect and provide some data on pro bono activity by Australian law firms. Now, we've got another question in the chat, which is, where does social enterprise or startups fit into the mix of what you're looking at?
Should I maybe jump in for that one, or do we?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, no, it's a good question, and it's I think our call for submissions explores sort of some of these questions about scope, and as we've talked about, it's very broadly defined what we're looking at, and the definition of philanthropy is broad and includes sort of volunteering and those sorts of things. And so, of course, we'd welcome feedback around that scope question. In terms of like social enterprise specifically, we didn't deal with that directly in our in the call for submissions paper, but we did sort of think about, for example, that there is a separate process that the government has had underway regarding impact investing, social impact investing, and there was a task force focused on that. And the current government, they were commissioned by the previous government, and the current government asked them to refresh their final report and provide it to the government for consideration. And we were thinking about whether, say, impact investing would be in scope for our inquiry. And I think that generally we're looking at sort of philanthropy sort of when there isn't kind of like a financial return, sort of like a element to it. But that doesn't mean that, say, impact investing wouldn't be relevant where there are some linkages to philanthropy, and there obviously are. And I think in the same way that social enterprise, like we're not looking sort of specifically at social enterprise per se, but where it's undertaken by charities, and there's different types of social enterprises, and there's that spectrum, and where sort of philanthropy is involved with them, it certainly would be in scope, and always mindful too of other processes that are underway as well, in government and other government levels of government around social enterprise. But it's probably not sort of something that's squarely in focus, but it would be there would be linkages there.
Thanks, Krystian. And I see Sari Baird has asked a question as well about whether the Commission's aware of international inquiries that have also looked at increasing philanthropy in those overseas jurisdictions and the sorts of opportunities and obstacles that have been found there. Sari, I don't know if you want to elaborate. Did you have a particular inquiry in mind in asking that question?
Thanks, Ian. My question was really just prompted by the discussion question number 9 and the request from the Productivity Commissioners for data that we might, an organisation like ours might have in relation to barriers, obstacles and opportunities for us as an agency that receives philanthropic and other support for international work. And it would just be interesting in trying to think about that, to know whether other governments have asked the same question of international organisations, and how they have responded, and whether the sort of complexity in the interface between taxation, different international standards, different international constraints, and sovereign policies in relation to how donations can be used have come up internationally, because we can only do so much in Australia, but if the destination and the organisations that we collaborate with are also a sort of handbrake or challenge in the process, we need to sort of be thinking, I think, in this case about sharing that information with the Commission. But obviously I don't want to reinvent the wheel. If there's information out there, it'd be great to have a steer on it. And I did have a quick look through the footnotes. So yes, I'd be really, it'd be just great to know if in your research that's come up at the Commission.
And Barry, I suppose I'll make a start, and I know that Krystian and Alex will add some information. As Alex said, we're at early days. So yes, we absolutely are looking overseas, and we're always particularly interested in jurisdictions that share a lot of similarities with us. So we often look at Canada and New Zealand for obvious reasons. But in the early stages, we're very interested in things that you might want to talk to us about. We're also interested in that broader issue about jurisdictional reach, because a lot of charities here do have overseas arms. So, any information that you say, look, please have a look at the way the tax treatment in New Zealand, and we're generally aware of things, but that would be really helpful. Krystian and Alex, did you want to add anything?
Krystian,
I think in terms of similar reviews inquiries that may have been undertaken overseas, although please don't quote me on this, based on what I know, this is the largest and most wide-ranging and comprehensive government-initiated inquiry examining this area anywhere in the world ever. That's what I know. And if there was something else, I would have been surprised that I haven't come across it in the last sort of 10 years. But so I think that there haven't been this kind of comprehensive types of examinations done elsewhere, but there've been lots of smaller, more targeted ones. There was a sort of a commission on giving that was sort of had some government funding, but it was kind of sector-led in the UK a few years ago, etc. We are very interested in organisations, and Julie alluded to this, that operate overseas and therefore have understanding and experience in other contexts as well. And obviously our friends in New Zealand that they've got different taxation arrangements there. There's a credit rather than a deduction, for example, and understanding some of those differences and their impacts, etc., that can feed into the ideas that we have and the analysis that we're undertaking.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we're particularly interested in if there's been any international, for want of a better word, policy experiments where you can actually show it's had a positive impact or a negative impact. So we're interested in those sorts of case studies. I mean, I should just add that the Productivity Commission, in terms of what we do and the inquiries that we undertake, and Krystian sort of alluded to this, we are unique around the OECD. We were the first sort of productivity body that was set up in the OECD, and just about all of the subsequent models that have been set up in other OECD jurisdictions, at least, have modelled themselves and have looked to Australia. So in that sense, I would be surprised if these other bodies had looked at philanthropy. That's not to say that other institutions, as Krystian mentioned, would have done them, but our model and the way that we receive terms of reference and the way that we undertake inquiries is unique around the world. And that's why this is such an exciting inquiry, because we get to look at everything with a clean sheet of paper and say, well, what can be done in this space. But yeah, the international comparisons, I mean, they're often fraught with difficulty, but it is something we're very much interested in from that establishing that evidence base to say, well, look, this worked in this jurisdiction. Here's why it might work in Australia, or maybe it won't, but it's an interesting lesson to think about those sorts of things.
And of course, speaking of the OECD, the OECD itself has done a very comprehensive report on philanthropy and taxation, which we've certainly been looking at, and we benefit from the fact that one of the authors of that report, Emeritus Professor Anne O'Connell, is based in Melbourne as well. So, you know, we certainly are looking broadly around all the work and research that's been undertaken.
Thank you.
And I suppose one question I've got, which sort of links into that, looking around internationally, is perhaps a bit of an assumption that more philanthropy is good, which is possibly, you know, all philanthropy is good philanthropy, which I think is not always the case. You know, some philanthropy might be bad philanthropy, and I'm interested in whether the Commission is looking at the potential anti-democratic nature or impact of some ways in which philanthropy is done. I mean, you only have to look at the US to sort of see how, depending on how you set your tax settings to encourage philanthropy and the sort of conditionality you allow donors to impose, you could have a situation where a lot of funding for sort of public services comes from a pretty small group of people who've got particular views of the world. And Australia's, from my perspective, always had a pretty good range of settings for philanthropy in terms of allowing a range of different people to contribute, and you know, a plurality of views and perspectives. So I'm just interested in the ways in which the Commission is sort of trying to take account of the way in which philanthropy is done. So more philanthropy, but ensuring that more philanthropy is done in a high quality way that's supportive of our democratic institutions. Is that sort of something that the Commission's interested in and is welcoming submissions on? And yeah, just interested in your approach to those sorts of issues.
I don't know if you can still hear me, Ian. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, there's something happening with my computer at the moment, not quite question though. Look, it is something that we are thinking about. You know, one angle is the effectiveness angle, and whether you know, some philanthropy might be more effective or have a greater impact than other forms. And then there is you know, we are interested in the sort of power relationships that might be created by certain forms of philanthropy and the way that it's set up. So that, you know, I think that's something that you're alluding to, but we'd be keen to hear submissions on that, and any case studies in particular, and whether, you know, given that those, you know, if there is these sort of power imbalances or relationships where, you know, philanthropy, you know, isn't achieving what you'd expect it to achieve, or it's not, you know, the giving that's undertaken is not what recipients necessarily want, then we're keen to hear about those kinds of case studies and examples.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think, yeah, certainly we are looking at the broader context here in terms of like understanding, okay, well, what is the role of government? What is the role of philanthropy? Not that we'll say declare what those roles are, but understanding what the context is, because that then follows through to sort of the consideration of specific issues and recommendations, etc. So we are, yeah, considering what the context is and what the roles are and why government, you know, provides support for philanthropy, that sort of thing, and then, you know, that point around democracy and like about how philanthropy is undertaken and the context there, and we do sort of reference that in the call for submissions paper on page 11 around some of the critiques of tax concessions and the impact on sort of power concentration and yeah, how sort of power is exercised in a democracy. And I suppose, yeah, so we very much welcome input and feedback around that, you know, the quality of philanthropy, the effectiveness of philanthropy, not just sort of the effectiveness of charities, which is sort of very directly referenced in the terms of reference, but the terms of reference do talk about the effectiveness of foundations as well, but also mindful that, you know, we're making recommendations to government. So what's the role of government there, in the sense that if there's, you know, a view that philanthropy, you know, needs to be directed in a particular way to be more effective and mindful of certain considerations, etc., that's all good, but how does that translate into? Is there a role for government? And then there may not be. It might be more that that's stakeholders and others sort of, you know, can provide accountability there. But, you know, there may be a role for government in terms of regulation, incentives, that sort of thing. But yeah, certainly welcome views on it.
Thank you. And are there other questions that people have? I can see Julian's put a comment in chat, but I think that sort of ties back to the social enterprise question from earlier. Are there any new questions that people have? Well, whilst people are thinking, well, can I just maybe ask you to give us a bit, I know you've got timelines already on the Commission website, but in terms of the process, you'll get a bunch of submissions that flow in on the 5th of May or near to, and then you're working on the interim report that will come out in November. Will you still be accepting comments, feedback from people in the lead up, because there's still the final report which will come out next year? Or what's the process you're going to have if bright ideas occur to people after the 5th of May, but sort of in the lead up, I guess, to that draft or interim report in November? Are people still, I mean, you're probably reluctant to say hold off and don't send in. You want everyone to send them in by the 5th of May. I understand that, but I mean, what's sort of your view of what people should be doing between the 5th of May and when that interim report comes out, if they do have ideas and want to sort of provide further feedback to you?
We're pretty flexible, Ian. We have the 5th of May because it's a practical issue. Our people have to start drafting. It's as practical as that. But we also will have some round tables, and we're hoping, we haven't settled on the topics yet because in a way we have to kind of see what the submissions are. And I would anticipate that we may have one on regulatory barriers where we would be coming back to you and to your members. We're never closed off to particular ideas. We just have a process because it helps us in writing the report, but we'll have some round tables. And certainly when we have a draft report out there, people often tell us with no concern, Ian, you got it wrong. So we're very open to that, but we're also very mindful that the nature of your membership is that you have a lot of technical expertise. So it would be not, the Commission would not have a position where it says, well, we're not interested in hearing like that. In fact, I was going to be bold enough to say to you, Ian, could we come back to you and some of your members on very specific things that we don't understand and have, to be honest, perhaps an in confidence conversation saying, we don't understand how that works. Can you help us? And we often do that with people like yourselves who have very strong technical experience. So Alex or Krystian, if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. I might just add, you know, in terms of this group, we're really interested in the specifics, you know, so, you know, if you know, people have had experience with complexity or high compliance costs or, you know, those sorts of issues, we're really interested in, okay, well, what's the solution, you know, and, you know, how would it be implemented? Would it be by legislation, regulation, regulatory sandbox, the kind of approach that you might take to actually get the job done? You know, I mean, it takes me back to the sort of, you know, when you hear from business about red tape, and they often complain about it, and then you say, okay, well, what's your top 5 things that you do? And nobody can, often you get back an answer that says, oh, well, So it's, yeah, we're really interested in those specifics, I think, from experts, as Julie mentioned. So, yeah, just add that.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go, Julie.
No, I was just going to say the other thing that we've already come across, Ian, is difficulties that member charities and organisations have across jurisdictions. Now, all of your members come from different jurisdictions, so we're very interested in hearing where you think things work pretty well or where, you know, we know with the fundraising, where it's just an incredible burden. We've heard a lot from, well, not a lot, but we've heard from people about the problem when they're actually operating across borders. So without, you know, putting a particular area in the frame as having spoken to us, but, you know, Albury, Wodonga, it's that type of stuff where people are delivering services between jurisdictions. Sorry, Krystian.
No, that's a really good point. And I think, yeah, like this group here and the expertise you have is really important and can play a really critical role in terms of informing our thinking, because as we've said earlier, and our terms of reference directors, do we have regard to past reviews? There's the Commission's own report led by Robert Fitzgerald in 2010. There's the Not-for-Profit Sector Tax and Session Working Group. There's the ACNC legislation review. All these processes, and we are looking at them certainly. And there's all the research that researchers do in our Ian and Natalie. I see Natalie and Rosemary on the call as well. And we've drawn upon a lot of that in the call for submissions paper as well. But and we're going to be looking at that. But also the benefit of submissions is that you don't have to rewrite, write a 30 or 40 or 50, 100-page submission. You can direct us and extract things from research that's been done or other reports. So, for example, Natalie, and sorry to point you out, the work you've done around the international context in terms of the geographic limitations around the DGR framework, etc. We referenced that in the call for submissions paper, but that's obviously something that is relevant to sort of regulation, etc., and impacts philanthropy beyond Australia's borders, etc. And so any of those insights will be they'll be really helpful, and I think will really contribute to the product at the end. And I think that one benefit of this process too is that it's a really comprehensive and it's wide ranging. We're looking at it's so broad, and I think that means that we can look at it quite holistically, and which maybe in the past hasn't always been possible.
Thank you. And I should say, yes, please, to the extent that you have questions and you want to come back to the Charity Law Association, please feel entirely free to do so, and then we can help find the appropriate person or people to get to the bottom of those questions. And I did have another sort of scope question for you, and that is, I know the Productivity Commission itself has in the past suggested for First Nations charities that it might be appropriate for there to be a ruling system in place, for the ACNC to be able to give binding rulings. Now, in some ways, the effectiveness of philanthropy might be improved if what can be done not by the intermediary, but by the charity that's actually doing something, perhaps at the end of the day, itself is a better use of the funds. Can I just check, does the scope extend to those sort of suggestions around, whether it be a ruling system or other measures like that would mean that the final use of the funds is a more effective use of funds, even if it's not for the step of the actual philanthropic giving itself?
Absolutely. It's like whether the ACNC could effectively give it site orders a bit like sort of, that sounds dramatic, but like in England and Wales, the Charities Commission can kind of make orders about how resources are used, etc.
I wasn't going quite that far. I mean, I like that concept, but that requires a referral of powers. But more just giving, issuing binding rulings in the same way the ATO can.
It is, look, that kind of issue we'd be keen to hear about. I mean, effectiveness is squarely in our terms of reference. And so we've been thinking about the advantages and disadvantages of having metrics, ways of measuring effectiveness and what that might mean for the sector and how you would do it and the difficulties associated with it and the potential unintended consequences. But if there's, other, regulatory sort of arrangements in terms of binding rulings or regulatory tools, whatever that might be, we'd be keen to hear about them. We're not saying we don't take a view on it a priori, but I'm very interested in hearing about those sorts of things.
And the other thing, Ian, is on the First Nations point, we are holding a number of sort of consultations. You're probably aware that we have responsibilities under Closing the Gap, so we're tapping into our networks, and particularly interested in hearing from the people who, and I'm just using this word in a generous sense, by the way, the beneficiaries or the recipients of charitable institutions, because that's pretty important. But like Alex says, we don't have any predisposed views. So it's pretty important that if you think that's something that is lacking perhaps in the ACNC framework, like Krystian was talking about overseas examples, please let us know about that.
Yeah, absolutely. We're looking at gaps in the regulation, and I think that if there's an assumption, it doesn't have to be this assumption that trust and confidence that is in the regulatory framework gives people the ability to make a gift and it has an impact on giving. Well, obviously that the regulatory framework is appropriate and that there aren't gaps and that there's certainty, which goes to the sort of the rulings point, etc., is certainly very valid. And just on First Nations, yeah, we have a strong focus on that, and we sort of reference some, say, issues in the context of the DGR framework for First Nations communities, and we are certainly engaging with them closely and also engaging with them in terms of their role practicing philanthropy in all its different forms, in terms of reciprocity, altruism, and how they practice it in Indigenous communities, as well as how philanthropy engages with Indigenous communities and supports their autonomy, that sort of thing.
Thanks, Krystian. And I see there's one more question that's been posted in the chat from Erica Myers-Davis. Is there a preferred format for submissions, and are there accommodations for people with disabilities or low literacy or English as a second language?
The answer to that is yes. We're working on, but I don't think, Francis, it's yet been released. We've been looking at a version that would be a more accessible document, and we're certainly working on that. Also, if we can, you can just put a comment in through the website, but we are very flexible. If there's somebody that would like to put a comment in, the way that we've organised our website or our processes are not as accessible as that person needs, please just contact us. We're contactable by our website or by phone, and we'll make arrangements for that. We're very conscious of that, and we're working quite hard. So it's actually pretty important, Ian, if people tell us, I can't make a submission, then we're all ears as to how that can be done. But as Alex said at the very beginning, you can just put a comment in. And when I worked on it's a really good question, because when I worked on the mental health inquiry, which ran for 2 years, we were very cognizant that we were dealing with people who might have something they want to say to us, but the whole process of going through the formal website and everything was very difficult. So we're trying to make ourselves as accessible as ever, but we're all ears. If we're not getting it right and you don't feel you can do it through traditional manners, tell us.
And the website, there's sort of accessibility systems in place, and there's an accessibility tab in terms of translation and that sort of thing as well, for like various services and that sort of thing.
Thank you. Well, we haven't got anyone else with their hands up, so it's probably, given we're about to reach the end of the hour, an appropriate time to finish up there. So I'd just like to really thank Alex, Julie and Krystian and the other Productivity Commission staff who've dialed into this call as well. It's just really, it's incredibly helpful just being talked through the process and getting a better understanding of what you're looking for, what's going to be helpful to you. So we really appreciate that. We look forward to putting our submissions in. I think all the academics on the call, you've made very excited with the breadth of the terms of reference. So we really look forward to it. Please feel free to reach out to CLAANZ for any particular questions or etc. that you have. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for having us, Ian.
Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.